Hello and welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by the wonderful Millete Birhanemaskel. I think Millete, you don't need any introduction to my listeners. I think everybody would know you, but just to be safe, she's a US-based journalist. She has been very, very prominent activist and advocate for Tigray for the past 3-4 years. And she's a community organizer, and she also runs a cafe, something that I learned very, very recently. Don't you, Millete? And
Yes.
welcome.
Thank you, Tigrayan. Honored to be on your show. I'm a big fan, and so I'm always happy to be here. It's not our first time together, so thank you.
Yeah, this is your second time, so you are in danger of becoming a friend of the channel, Millete.
It would be an honor. It is an honor.
It's my pleasure. So, Millete, maybe you're going to start by taking us through the events that you had in Denver lately, the Tigrayan community. There was a Tigrayan festival. You had meetings with some important people. So please take us through some of the things that the Tigrayan community in Denver has been up to lately.
I would love to. So the Tigray Community of Colorado is a 30-year-old organization. Actually, this is our 30th year, and I'm the first woman chair of the organization, which is really incredible. Just a little history. My father was one of the founders. Actually, when I was a young girl, recently we were looking back at the founding documents, and there was his name. So. Which is really cool. But anyway, he passed about 15 years ago, so he's been gone for a while now. But so the Tigray community has been very active, and especially over the past few years, particularly with our young people, because we saw the toll that, first of all, just life in America, young Black kids in America, but add to that, COVID, add to that genocide. And as you know, it was young people who were advocating for the people of Tigray, who were running Twitter campaigns, who were, calling legislators, who were marching and protesting and educating in their schools, holding programs. And it took a big toll on them. Many of them who were born here, raised here, don't speak Tigrayan, never been to Tigray, maybe never even been to, Africa, period, who stood up for their families. And it was hard. It was very difficult, actually. We had a number of issues here up to and including suicide by young people who couldn't handle the stress. And so I came in as president, and it's definitely a labor of love. I did it because I saw what was happening, the increased drug use and drug abuse among our young people, and no one was paying attention. We were so focused on everything that's happening back home, rightfully so, that we ignored our children, and the impact was pretty devastating. And so that's why I agreed to jump into the position. And so it's been about 1.5 years, and we've done a lot of work around identity building with our young people, because they were very confused after the war started in terms of what is an Ethiopian, what is a Tigrayan, and why are we the enemy? There was just a big gap in understanding. And so we do a lot of work around identity building and making sure, just like a tree that has good roots, that tree, nothing can knock it down. But if you've got flimsy roots, or, anything can kill that, right? So we put a lot of energy into our young people and making sure they know who they are. So as you mentioned, Tigray Festival just happened in Denver. It was a week-long celebration. It was a great festival. People came from all over North America, but all over the world, actually, to come and celebrate being a Tigrayan and what all of that means, which is, after years, after at least 3 years, if not longer, of being demoralized and dehumanized, and to come together and celebrate our beauty, I think is powerful. And we certainly saw that. Our city was flooded with people from all over. And there were conferences held, and of course every night there were celebrations and parties, and people looked beautiful, and clothing and hair and the whole nine. So at the community center, we held, we call it Tigray Paints. And so we had a young Tigrayan artist come, and she did a painting of the martyrs Tigrayan-American. And so it was really beautiful. And young people talked about, what that was and what it meant. And also we did a lot of work around like our names. Every time we do an event, we always ask the young people, what is your name and what does it mean? And that's intentional. It's very intentional because our names are very powerful. So that was, what we did. And then we helped, obviously met with President Getachew, who was here, and people were thrilled to see him. And we made sure he met with some of our lawmakers and powerful people in the city who have been friends of Tigray over the past few years. It was a successful event, I would say.
Well, we'll get back to the meeting you had with Getachew, and also you made him meet the mayor of Denver, and they had some discussion about connection Denver-Aksum connection. But to get back to actually also other important points that you raised, Millete, it's wonderful that you are addressing the impact of the war on children. I think that is a often neglected issue. I don't think it occurs to many people to think that the war, in addition to on adults, and in addition to, of course, the devastation that it has wrought on Tigray, it also has had an impact on our children in the diaspora. And it's wonderful that you are actively and consciously trying to do something about that on the children. And maybe we're going to come back to that as well. And also your attempt to try to make sure that children have, their grounding, their root in Tigray. That's also wonderful. I actually watch a clip of you asking children to describe or to sort of describe what the name is and to tell what the meaning is. And I think that's a wonderful way of making sure that children have some sort of connection to their deep sense of who they are. But to get back to the festival, Millete, I know that you, before we started recording, you told me you didn't attend, but what was the general impression that you got from the festival?
Well, a few things. One, there was a lot of pride, and you felt that very much. And so that was a very beautiful experience, even not attending the events. I'm not very much of a party person. And so I don't generally, attend parties, maybe. And to be honest with you, a lot of that started because of the war. I mean, I was just so sad and so depressed. And so, I didn't feel it was my right to have joy when our families were suffering the way that they were, which, by the way, I don't think that's good advice at all. I think you should find joy no matter where you are. If you think of even Tagaroti, they go into the mountains dancing, not knowing if they're going to come back, and singing and still living their life. And so I think people should enjoy themselves, but it's not in me yet, and I'm not there yet, so I don't tend to do that. But I still felt in different restaurants and different gatherings, and a lot of people. You mentioned my cafe. I have an African espresso bar and social justice cafe in town, and so many Tagaru, came. And I'm in downtown Denver, far away from where a lot of these events were happening, but people were coming because they just wanted to say hello. And so I love that the community there got to see so much beauty from our culture. And a lot of people were active in supporting and trying to help end the war in Tigray, who only know me, who have never met another Tigrayan, even in many instances. So it was nice for them to see so many of us at one time. And so that was beautiful. I do think there were some missed opportunities with the festival. I mean, it's great to come together and celebrate. And I mean, let's face it, we're Africans. We like to dance and we love music and we love joy, all of that. But I think there are other ways to do it that can have more impact, and that was why the art event was so important to me. I mean, some people will say it's just an art event. It's just some kids painting, like what a waste of time, maybe is how someone will see that. But I see the other extreme. I mean, if you want to take care of Tigray, take care of Tigray's children. If these kids are okay, if they know who they are and they feel connected to their culture, they will always go back. They will always, when they're in those leadership positions, they'll remember where they come from. But if we don't give that to them at a young age, good luck doing that later when people are adults and, and have different connections. So You know, I just think moving forward, we have to think differently about how we organize when we have so many people together. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of Tagaru here. You know, we're already little Tigray. There's a lot of Tigrayans who live in the Denver area, so Denver metro area. And so to have that many more coming in, what an opportunity. And you know, we missed that opportunity in many ways, including how we address our leadership. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love President Getachew as much as anybody else because he represents the resistance. He represents, you know, survival. Like he represents so much. I think for many of us, but he's also a politician. He's also the president. He works for the people. We are supposed to hold him accountable, you know, and I feel like there was a lot of like populist sort of, you know, like run behind him. And, you know, it was a lot. It was a lot. It was a little bit difficult actually to watch in many instances. And there was some fair criticism, I think, with different media outlets too about, why are people not asking the tough questions, or why are, you know, it was a lot. I'll just say that.
Well, I think you raised a lot of important questions that I want us to sort of draw on a little bit in terms of missed opportunity. I don't know if you have noticed, but some people on social media actually took exception to the way the festival was organized in terms of, for instance, who was invited and who wasn't invited. Some people said that other people from opposition parties should also have been invited to the event. It shouldn't have been just a government representative or the president in this case. And some people say that Tigrayan events, I know that you mentioned joy and celebration as a way of resistance, and we come to that. But some people say that Tigrayan events generally tend to be more dancing extravaganza rather than, you know, serious discussions about problems and seriously holding people to account. And I don't know if you have some views or opinions about that, but at least that is some of the criticism that people have been leveling at generally at the event, not so much at the people who have been invited, but at the organizers of the event.
I think it's fair. I think it's fair. I mean, if there are, which we know there are, opposition groups who could have been there, why not? You know, why would we not be intentional about bringing different voices into these spaces? We say the same thing about the lack of women who are represented in these different spaces. You know, there's always one token, but, you know, it's not enough. And so, you know, I think the more people with different views you have, that competition of ideas is always a good thing. I think we just need to change, or at least think differently about, you know, is what the way that I think about things anyway, when people invite me into different circles, which is always an honor if someone thinks of you and invites you to a space. But I always think, how does this help Tigray? Is by me doing this, is it beneficial to Tigray or Tigrayans, Tigrayan people? I don't care if it's there, back home, or here, even in the diaspora. Is it beneficial? And if I don't feel like it is, you know, then I'm not going to do it. You know, I won't participate in it. And so I think we have to think differently too when we're putting on these kind of events. Like, how does this better the people, or, you know, or Tigray? And I don't know that we always have that in mind. I think our metrics are off in terms of how we measure success. It's too often just tied to how much money did we make, you know, how much money was raised, which, don't get me wrong, I understand the need for rebuilding and the need for financial help back home, but I'm not sure that's the only metric we should be paying attention to when we host these kind of events. So, you know.
Well, yeah, I think having as your yardstick financial gain, although, you know, it has its place, I think it's something that should be revised. If that is how they are measuring the success of events, by how much money they are able to amass. Again, like you said, as much as, you know, as important as money is now for Tigray. Another thing you mentioned, Millete, in terms of people trusting Getachew, and actually some of the clips that I watched are a bit cringe-inducing in terms of the. You know, a cynic might say sycophancy, but I'm not going to use that word. I think it's more sort of adoration, and I understand where it comes from, because given what, because Getachew, in some sense, is sort of a representative of the Tigray people, and given what Eritrean forces and Ethiopian forces had tried to do against Tigray, to have the opportunity to meet the person who was sort of at the pinnacle of that resistance, I understand it's going to always induce that sort of adoration and respect. But you're right, there is a tendency to trust politicians, to hold back from being critical of them, to hold back from asking them serious questions. And some people might say, again, this is sort of another part of what we want. I want us to discuss, you and me, Millete. Some people say that the diaspora has become too trusting of the transitional government. And when they would say, you know, the people who are critical of how the diaspora has been conducting itself for the past, since the Pretoria Agreement, would say that we should have been more critical of the interim government. We are taking everything they say at face value. So, for instance, Getachew made a lot of promises at the festival, at the event, but nobody asked him whether or not, for instance, he had delivered on the promises that he had made before, or if there is any guarantee that he's going to deliver on the promises that he's making now. So generally, there is a tendency on the part of the diaspora to be very lenient on the transitional government. What do you say about that? Do you see where those people who say that are coming from?
I do see that. You know, I obviously met with President Getachew and had conversations, and we asked him important questions and tough questions. I don't think he even shies away if he's asked, you know what I mean? I think he understands his responsibility, and I think he's willing to be honest, maybe sometimes too honest in how he responds. I think sometimes he says too much in terms of, you know, with his position and maybe what he should be saying. But I think that the issue falls on us in terms of in the diaspora and what our expectations are. I also don't want to make it seem like these are not superhuman people. I mean, President Getachew is just a man, you know, and the position he's in is an almost impossible position. And I think that you're right. So much of the Pretoria Agreement still has not been enforced. I also don't know that it's necessarily, it is his job actually to raise those issues, but it's really our job to agitate. You know, it's our job to agitate, not just him, but even I was going to say Ethiopian government. There was a point the Ethiopian government was concerned with what the diaspora had to say, because our bark was pretty vicious. And I think they can see that it's sort of been tamed to some degree. And so they're no longer as concerned with what the diaspora is saying. And so I think we have to find our voice again. And I think that really we're looking for someone like Getachew to lead us out when it's us who will do that. And so I think sometimes we're a little unfair in terms of who we blame for things not happening. He's the president, so the buck stops there, obviously, with him. But I don't know that we're you know, focused on the right things. But I do think that we too have to come out of this. Slumber is probably not the right word, but you know, just like you said, if you watch the videos, there were some cringeworthy moments, you know, where you're like, oh God, you know. Don't get me wrong. I remember the first time I met former President Obama, and I was thrilled to death, and of course took a picture with him and all of that. And but I also said to him at the time how hard Ethiopian Americans were working for him to help him be elected, and that we hope he's paying attention to what's happening back home. So, you know, you have those moments where you can find someone you admire, but you also need to use those opportunities to further your cause, whatever your cause is. So I think we're finding that balance. Don't forget, Tigrayans, including in the diaspora, are still very traumatized. Many of us, including myself, have not dealt with the level, you know what I mean, of trauma that I don't think we truly understand where we are. You know, we're just starting to come out and just trying to heal when we're actually still in chaos. So many parts of Tigray are still occupied. So much, you know, food is being withheld still. You know, when it was Ethiopian government, it was easy for us to speak up. And now it's the actual institutions whose very duty is to deliver food and make sure people don't starve, who are saying we can't control the corruption. Well, then maybe you shouldn't be in charge, you know, if you can't control that. So there's so much work to do.
Yeah, I think Millete, I think agitation is a good word that you used. And let's just modern on that word a little bit, because I think it's a very powerful word. And generally, Tigrayans are very good at agitating against people whom we clearly identify as enemies. And we have demonstrated that for the past 3 years against Eritreans, agitation and asking the right questions. And, the Tigrayan diaspora has done a phenomenal job in terms of that. But I think there is, when it comes to people whom we consider on our side, and, Getachew is on our side on the big picture perspective, we tend to hold back. And I think partly it's because, at least for people who were raised in Tigray, we are culturally conditioned to be reverential to people in political positions and stuff like that. And partly in the current situation is because there is a tendency for people to think that holding Getachew to account seriously, for instance, in DC, would sort of, in some sense, embolden the enemies. So we're not, we're going to suppress our true emotions. We're going to hold back our cautions, and we're going to pretend that, Getachew is a hero and everything happening in Tigray is wonderful and stuff. So there's that sort of inhibition that comes from not wanting to give a stick with which the enemy would sort of beat you. Or, Getachew came to the US and he was humiliated by his own people and stuff. So you don't want people to say that. So I don't know how we bring about it, sort of a cultural revolution or cultural change in that respect. Millete, I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah, no, you're very clear. I agree. Yeah, even as someone who grew up, I grew up in the diaspora. First time I went back home, I was 18 years old. But I see that very much. And I think cultural revolution is the perfect word. Like, we have to know that you can challenge your leadership, and that doesn't mean you're against them. In fact, it means the opposite, because you're challenging the very people, and they need that. For example, I was a little bit concerned about, here's our president, a man who survived the unthinkable, and he's here. What should that opportunity be used for? It should be used to further the interests of the country, not necessarily to be, in a room full of Tigrayans just being an echo chamber. So I think when we pushed him a little bit and were able to arrange meetings with like our local leadership here, which the mayor of Denver is a pretty powerful person. He may, you may think he's just a mayor, but actually he's it's a pretty powerful city, and they have a huge impact regionally, and and even with Aksum, with the Denver sister city relationship that we have. I mean, they've done huge projects in Aksum, like around water and sanitation, and so much around schools, and pretty impactful things. So since then, I think once we pushed him into that sort of different sort of way of using his trip, he rounded out his trip doing those same things when he went to DC. So it takes us to push our leadership. That's true anywhere, by the way. It's not just Tigray, that's anywhere. If the people can be strong enough and push hard enough, then you can change the direction of things. So some of that falls on us, absolutely falls on us. And that culture of reverence, I get it. Or, you hear it from your parents, like, you know what I mean? They don't want to be embarrassed, or, what are the enemies? Why would you say that publicly? And we have to get past that. We really have to get past that, and just, because we're not going to say it privately either, let's be honest. So we might as well just say it when we have the opportunity. There's a lot of criticism that I've heard among Tigrayans about how our soldiers are not being taken care of, for example, or how we're not being aggressive enough in terms of, like, taking back our lands, our occupied lands. So rather than being in a room where you're just clapping your hands for somebody, why not clap and welcome him into the room, but then ask those tough questions? Just a lot of missed opportunity there. And it's a cultural issue. I agree with you. But I think there's a lot of brave people who are pushing those boundaries, and I think we're getting there.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy that you agree with me. There should be some sort of cultural revolution, Millete, and because you have been engaged with teaching children in Denver, maybe that's a good place to start. But I think to expand on the sort of predicament that the Tigrayan diaspora is in, Millete, I think another problem and I would like to hear what you think. Another problem is there is some sort of confusion that has crept into the Tigrayan diaspora following the so-called Pretoria Agreement. And so, on the one hand, you have the interim government in Tigray that is trying to work in collaboration with the Ethiopian regime. Well, because the circumstances have forced it to work in collaboration with the Ethiopian regime, and as part of the collaboration, that is sort of implied in what they say and they do, is that the issues of justice and accountability and stuff that happened in Tigray should just be brushed aside for now, and let's focus on humanitarian aid. Although we'll come back to that later, the aid has been suspended now. Let's just focus on normalizing relations and let's just pretend that nothing has happened. And you sort of, on a good day, you understand what they're trying to do. And the Tigrayan diaspora wants to do stuff that would be a positive contributor to that sense of direction, right? You don't want to spoil anything. All right, if that's what you want to do, we're going to help you do that. If that's what you think is in the best interest of Tigray, if you think that the issue of justice and accountability should be deferred for another time, then we're going to help you do that. But on the other hand, there are people, Tigrayans in the diaspora who say that, no, we're not going to let the Ethiopian regime and the Eritrean forces and the Amhara forces off the hook like that. After they have, murdered 1 million people, after they have destroyed Tigray, after they have, caused all sorts of devastation in Tigray, we're not going to be quiet, and we're going to speak up against that, and we're going to push for justice and accountability. And if you have those two seemingly conflicting sort of, missions, it's very difficult to work out what it is that you should ask the Tigrayan government, for instance, when you have an opportunity to ask a Tigrayan president. And I think that sort of confusion. And I wonder what you think about that, Millete.
If you think about when the diaspora was its most powerful, it was when we had no communication with the government. Just think about it. That is when we were most effective, because we weren't waiting for direction, because we couldn't get direction. They were completely cut off. So there was no way to know what people in those leadership positions wanted from us. So when we didn't have that kind of input, the diaspora self-organized and said, here's what makes sense, and did all the things that needed to be done to bring the war to an end. So now, and I would argue it's still not at an end, because of occupied lands and everything else. So now the confusion comes about because Pretoria seemed like such a bad deal. I don't know that that's fair to say, because of the condition and the situation that people were in, and so many people were dying. So I don't think it's fair to say it was a bad deal, even though people, including myself, were very confused when we first saw the documents. But if it, at some point we'll get those stories from the people who made those negotiations. This isn't the time, but sometime we will, and we'll be able to understand that deeper. But it tells you just how bad things were and maybe still are, that they had to agree to this deal. But my point is, I think the issue in the diaspora now is we're waiting for a government to give us direction. It doesn't even make sense. We are activists, which means you're change makers. You're trying to improve a situation. You're generally, I won't say fighting a government, but you're generally in contention, right? And trying to make something better. And so I think the reason that we can't get it together right now is because we're waiting for direction from the wrong place. We know we know, we're very clear about what the issues are, even if we're not on the ground, the ones who are actually doing the work, which would be, ideally is what the government is doing, right? Which they probably are. I don't think anyone there has malintentions, but we're confused because we're looking for leadership in the wrong place. And so I think there needs to be just a rude awakening in the diaspora so we can figure out what we need to do and how we need to do it. There was something else you said that, in terms of justice and accountability. So it's hard because I think we have to think in parallel. In one way, things are still occurring. So you're looking for justice and accountability on the one hand, but the crimes are ongoing. And that feels like an impossible, like a dog chasing its tail, sort of, because it hasn't ended. And so you're just going in this circle, and no one is listening anyways. That's the bottom line. And that's what we have to be realistic about. And they're not listening because we're confused. Our voice is being, our voices are being drowned out because we don't have one uniform voice anymore. There's still people doing really, really good work. I mean, obviously Brad Sherman is an amazing guy in Congress who won't let this die. And that's because there are Tagaro in the background who are doing the work to make sure he's informed, to make sure he's getting whatever evidence is needed. He's not just some magical man. He probably doesn't research at all what's happening. It's the information is given to him, and so he's from reliable people, and he's able to use that to push for change. So I don't want to discount, because there are people who are still Tagaro who are still doing incredible work. But we could be so much powerful, and we have to shift our way a little bit. We have to change gears in terms of how we're doing things now, because it's still an emergency, but it's a different kind of emergency now. So the other big thing that I'm pushing for and hope for that we can do in a more organized way is get more of us to be able to go back home and actually use our brain power, which I think is way more valuable than any dollars that we can scrape together to help change the ways, not just I mean, there's obviously practical, easy things, like there's a group of Tigrayan architects who gather regularly now and who meet regularly now as a result of what's happened over the past few years. These are the right people to go back and work with their counterparts in Tigray to rebuild amazing structures and thoughtful structures that maybe can, address some of the things that have happened over the years, in terms of like, how do you build a structure that's not as easily destroyed, or, what I mean, those kind of things. I mean, how are you going to beat missiles from the sky? But you know what I'm saying, though, like just building back smarter in ways that are more effective and, that don't hurt our environment and all of those things. And there are groups like that for everything, you name it. So how do we now start that mission of getting, being able to, and a lot of these are going to be young people who maybe can't afford, to just take a month or two off. So how do we figure that out economically? How do we figure all of those things out? I mean, there's so much that we could do, assuming we can get access. And I think there's some amount of access at this point, maybe not fully. But we just got to start thinking differently about what we're doing and what's more effective and who our leaders are. The government is fine. Those are the people who are in power now. Those are not the leaders of the diaspora. And so that's why we're so confused. And so we need to step back from that a little bit and reclaim some of our power. But that's just my 2 cents. I don't know.
Oh, it was 5 cents at least. But no, it's good that you mentioned the people, the Tigrayans, working away behind the scenes. It's easy to forget that there are people who are not on the limelight, or not in public view, or not on the forefront in the sense of being recognized, but behind all these statements and sanctions and laws that have been passed in favor of Tigray. There's always the hands of Tigrayans slogging away behind the scenes. So, it's always good to remind ourselves that we have they have our back, and we have theirs. And I think it's good that you mentioned that, Millete. But I think to press you on a little bit on this, Millete, I think one sort of a charitable interpretation of what the Tigray interim government, again, we should tell ourselves that there are a lot of people in the diaspora who are not happy with the Tigrayan government, with the performance, who say that the Tigrayan government should have pushed for more, for the Eritreans and the Amhara forces to leave Western Tigray, for instance, and for other things that even according to the Pretoria Agreement, Tigray would have been entitled to. And they say that the Tigray government hasn't been as firm as they would have liked it to be. But a charitable understanding of what the Tigray government is trying to do would be that it's trying to not be provocative, to just say, all right, let things take as much as they take. Our utmost priority is to avoid another round of war in Tigray, and we're going to be patient, and we're going to work positively with the Ethiopian regime. That would be one positive interpretation, or charitable interpretation. And people in the diaspora who take that view, who take that interpretation, might take the view that, all right, if that is the case, then we're going to hold back everything that we might otherwise have said, for instance, in terms of pushing for justice, not relying on direction from the Tigray government and just doing stuff that you would do otherwise, because they would fear that if they were to do that, it would disturb the balance. I think that is the very, very tricky problem that I'm sure a lot of people are grappling with, and I don't know how you tackle that.
You're right. We're accused of sabotage. Actually, I have been accused of that. Accused of that when you're too honest about what's happening. I recall even early on when we first got just shortly after Pretoria, hearing from people who are saying like we're so confused because if we speak up, we're told that we're impeding the peace process, that we're disrupting the peace process. But if we don't, we're being traumatized. We're actually not, in a better situation than we are in, and we're being asked to pretend that we are. So, I agree with you. I think it's tricky in terms of, especially for those of us who are not in Tigray, in terms of how we speak, because let's face it, social media is powerful, and you have narcissists running Ethiopia. And so you say the wrong things and it catches enough steam, you could cause more damage, in terms of what's happening. However, at what cost? At what cost is that silence coming? We have all of these displaced, millions of people, 2 million people displaced or missing. For how long? For how long are we going to be silent and pretend we have something we don't have? I think our strongest sources of information, and this is another reminder for the diaspora, because we keep looking to the government. It wasn't the government, actually, that was our best source of information even when we had even limited access. It was the institutions, it was the doctors, it was those groups who were gathering whatever data they could to tell you what was happening. Do you remember that with Eider Hospital? They were one of the best sources of information. And those are not government leaders, but they felt like it. It felt like we got more information from them, than we were getting from people who were in power. So, what is too much information? What is not? What's the right response? What's not? We're gonna just tippy-toe that. What can you do? But I don't think that silence is helping us. I don't think that pretending everything is okay is helping us. People are still dying of starvation. We heard that recently about infants, at the hospital who would die because they don't have infant formula or medicine or what, all of these things. So it's, I just firmly, maybe because I was in journalism for so long, but I believe sunshine disinfects. You have to be honest about what's happening, and there could be some fallout. But if it's the reality, why would we hide that? And we do have a culture of like let that go. It's just give it time. Well, that time comes at a cost. So I don't have an answer for that, but I do think, we have to, I would err on the side of speaking up and like you, you do it regularly, actually.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if what I do, which is generally being upfront and stir up stuff for people to think about, I'm not entirely sure if that is productive. And the reason that I do is I do that. So, for instance, now I don't know if it sense I'm being very, very careful not to say stuff that wouldn't be useful. But on my Facebook, to a limited number of people, I tend to say stuff that I think might provoke people into thinking. But interesting, you mentioned, for instance, the what they call internally displaced people, IDPs in Tigray, I think close to 1 million. So, for instance, if in normal circumstances, for instance, you would ask Getachew when he will return them to their homes, that would be very, very basic question that you would ask to someone who is a president.
Mhm.
But if you were to ask him now that, for instance, that question in Denver, I'm just trying to see things from Getacheo's point of view. And how would he make a promise if, for instance, the return of the IDPs is at the mercy of the Ethiopian regime, for instance? So, for instance, assume that Getacheo said, all right, we're going to do that in a month. And if that doesn't happen in a month, he would be compromised, right? I think that might be one problem that people are sort of having in their mind, and that is hold them back from asking. Okay, I might ask him, but I know that he doesn't really have the power to do stuff without the blessing of the regime. So it's a tricky situation. So I'm going to just pretend that there is no, there is no such question. But I'm not saying that's the right thing. I think what should have happened, in my view, what should have happened is the agreement should have been very, very clear in terms of when IDPs will be returned, in terms of when Amhara and Eritrean forces will be removed, and what would happen if they refuse to leave Tigray. Everything should have been clearly stipulated, but that didn't happen. And I think that is costing us everything now.
Absolutely.
And the Tigray government should have pushed for clarity. But they have been happy to be used by Abiy. So everything is now being done on Abiy's terms. And we know Abiy is a very Machiavellian person. He wants, the status quo to continue for as long as possible. And the Tigray government people are completely mistaken in their approach. I think they should have sought clarity, and they should have made sure that there were observers and people who implemented the agreement to the T, to to every detail. So they have failed in that respect. But I think in terms of the Tigrayan diaspora now, those are the issues that they are grappling with. I'm just trying to understand the psyche of the people, and I don't know how you get out of these kind of problems. I really don't know.
I agree. I also don't think that the Tigrayan government had the bargaining power to get that specific when they were in South Africa. I really think they were up against a wall, and they pretty much had to take whatever was given to them. I mean, just speculating, we don't know all the details of why. I mean, we have a lot of information, but I don't think that they really had, I don't think that it wasn't clear to them. They didn't make those timelines clear. You know what I mean? I mean, there were clear timelines in terms of when TDF would disarm, what that would look like, when the government of Tigray would disarm, all of those things they had timelines attached to them. But the return of occupied land did not have timeline. It was very vague, just like the goal for justice and accountability. I mean, it's just a joke that a government would investigate itself for its own crime. I mean, in the whole, it's a joke. But I just don't think they had the power. And so I don't know if it was a failure on their part, because I don't think that they even had that in the bargaining chips, given the situation of everything that was happening. But we do, in the diaspora, we do have that power. We have so much more power than we think. And initially, when we were enraged, and people were very, very much online and very, very much, doing everything possible. I mean, I can speak for us in the US. Our Congress people went from a zero understanding of Tigray to 1,000, and in some cases we were starting at a negative because the storyline had been already told by either a government sympathizer or by Abiy's, he hired all of these organizations here to help him. And so, we had a disadvantage in many ways. So I think a lot of that has changed now. We have a lot more people in power who are sympathetic, who have a better understanding. But don't forget, even though I don't necessarily know that this is a proxy war, the US in particular is struggling because it has no stronghold in the area. It's, and it's competing with China and Russia and is way behind. And so, they're almost making empty threats, especially around like human rights and these things. And, I don't know. I think there's a big mess. It's just all such a big mess. There's so much happening.
Yeah. What I think, one of the one of the bright aspects of the past 2 years was the Tigrayan diaspora. I think the Tigrayan diaspora has moved mountains. It was amazing how Tigrayans came together, and even upstaged actually the Ethiopians, even though they had a sheer number, because we were really energized and organized. Well, also to be fair, we had just cause and the truth on our side, so it's relatively easier in that sense. But the current state of stasis worries me, because if the situation continues, if the confusion continues, what might happen is people might become apathetic, and that is something that you really, really don't want to happen. And I wonder if people maybe should, like you, journalists who have opportunity to speak to people, to ask people, if we should find ways to make sure that the Tigrayan community is kind of rejuvenated and revivified into life, because it's a very, very important for the Tigrayan community. And I think that discussion should be had now, because the status quo in terms of the inactivity among the Tigrayan diaspora and the confusion and the unhappiness is very, very destructive. And the sooner we address that, the better, I think, Millete.
I agree. And I think that, when the war started, all of these organizations that were born out of that chaos, they did a lot of work. I think now is the time where the community centers step in, because now is the time where these, you could say, institutions, because we have these community centers all over the country, for example, in North America, I'm sure in Europe as well, that have been gathering places for community for a long time. Now is the time that those organizations can step in and sort of bring us all back to the circle, so we can, sort of reset, regroup, re-energize, refocus, be in the same place. We don't need that. We still need all of those groups that were formed, don't get me wrong, and they have specific work that relates specifically to things that are happening specifically in Tigray. But I think our issue now too is we have so much healing to do, and some of it we have to do simultaneously while we're still fighting and working for Tigray. In fact, absolutely have to do simultaneously. But there has to be like parallel work happening. Otherwise, I think a lot of this confusion too is just we're so tired. I can surely speak for myself, and I'm sure for you, you were very, very active in documenting and interviewing and making sure that the truth was being told, and now so many books have been written, and so, we're doing we've come so far in such a short amount of time. And that's what's impressive about Tigrayan people, and, and how I hope, and my hope and my wish is that we can organize outside of chaos as well, because in the midst of chaos, we're untouchable. The way that we came together, the way we collaborated, the way we worked. It is there will be stories written about this. I know there will be. We just haven't made it, out of the fire far enough yet to look back and go, wow, because it really is incredible. It's really incredible what's been done. But now we need to do a little bit of like self-healing and, recentering, so we can get back to being effective again. But I know we'll do it. I think we can do it.
Yeah, we could. Yeah. I think we'll have to sort of park the diaspora train here, Millete, because I want to ask you the remaining time to touch on other issues. But I think, I hope we have raised the issues that every Tigrayan in the diaspora community should reflect upon. I think there's a lot of discussion that should be had in the Tigrayan diaspora, and I hope that we have sort of given people some pointers in terms of what it is that people are thinking about, what are the sources of confusion, where is the inactivity coming from, and why is the relationship with the Tigrayan government a little bit difficult and tricky, and I'm sure it's going to spur discussions in households and stuff, and that's all we can hope for. But you briefly mentioned, Millete, that you had informally met Getachew. I don't know how much you would feel comfortable divulging your discussion, but if you could tell us at least your impressions, what would the discussion like, what would the energy like, and what were you left with in terms of your sort of understanding?
It was very brief. I spent probably in total about an hour with him, and it was primarily because I wanted to introduce the current leader of Tigray with the leadership here in Denver. So we met with the former Mayor Wellington Webb, the first Black mayor in Denver, who started the Denver-Aksum sister city relationship in a very tenuous time as well. I remember I may have been in middle school or something at the time, and when they started that relationship, and I vividly remember Haru protesting a Denver Aksum sister city. And I didn't know enough because my parents shielded us from that understanding of why that was happening. But I vividly remember people across the street not want, and this isn't a governmental sort of, even though it's the governments of both cities have a relationship, it's not a political relationship. This is like a people to people, sort of thing. And I remember being really confused about that, but it was Mayor Webb who worked with Daniel Yohannes, Daniel Yohannes, of course, worked with the Obama administration, who came together with leaders in our community like Tsagai Hailu and so many other really giants in the Tigrayan community here to form that relationship. And so it was important to me that President Getachew meet with Mayor Webb. And it was important to me because during this 3 years, when we had no friends and we were trying to tell our story, and these, so many people wouldn't give us the time of day, it was people like him who vouched for us and said, you need to meet with this group. You need to meet with, whoever in our communities. He showed up, he wrote letters to lawmakers and to the State House. And I mean, just really worked hard, the State Department, to make sure that, that our voice was told, that our story was told. And so to me, those are the allies, the people that you want to make sure you meet with and say, thank you, and so we met with him first. And then we met with, we have a new mayor in Denver, Mayor Mike Johnston. And so it was time for, an introduction to make sure that he understands who we are as Tigrayans before, you better tell your story before someone else does, because it's not going to work out for you if so, you know what I mean? If you don't. And so we spent all in all about an hour. I found President Getachew to be very, and of course I've interviewed him many times on Tigray Media House over the years. But I found him to be like very sincere, very optimistic. I think that he's seen so much and experienced so much that he really does have this different understanding of like gratitude of life, and he almost lost his life many times, and so many people did lose their lives over the course of these few years. So I wish I had more time with him, and I look forward to a chance to really be able to meet him and others, back home and really understand their stories. But I enjoyed that time. I asked him a few of those questions we were talking about in terms of like our occupied lands and, some of that. And, his answer was, this is, with our agreement, this is a responsibility of the federal government. And so we're waiting to see that the federal government will fulfill its obligation. That's very political. It's a very political answer to give. I still think that there's a lot of pressure from the diaspora that needs to be put on the State Department that helped negotiate this entire thing, even though they want to pretend it was an African solution. It was not, it was very much the work of the State Department, and that's fine. It is what it is. But in terms of the meetings with the mayors, Mike Johnston absolutely made a commitment to ensure that the Denver-Aksum sister city relationship thrives, and that we can help restore, to the extent that we can, parts of Aksum. And we have a lot of water projects and sanitation projects and things like that were pretty big infrastructure projects. So I think there's a lot of hope that we can revive and restore and, bring like that brain power, and certainly financially too, but sometimes that's not the issue. It's really the professionals that we need. And so there was a good commitment there. We were able to give him our story about some things, and President Getachew was very personable. So, they related, they were laughing. I mean, it was a great conversation. So, I have hope there. I think that he's generally genuinely a good person. So I still think we pressure him. I still think you ask tough questions. I still think you push people, and, you know, he may not always like me, or I may not always, you know, like him, or, you know, in terms of like our opinions on things, and who cares? We still can work together, you know, and accomplish what we need to for the people of Tigray. So it was good. It was great meetings.
Yeah. Well, I think you're doing wonderful things in terms of the connection you're trying to create between Denver and Aksum. I hope something really positive comes out of that. Tigray could do with that sort of association. It was interesting that you said when you asked Getachew about Western Tigray, he said that that was the responsibility of the federal regime, and like you said, that is the politically correct answer that you'd expect him to give. But it's also interesting in another sense, because if that is what the Tigray government really believes should happen, and if that is the understanding that they have, and if that is also the understanding that the other the observers, for instance, the US government has, maybe that is what the Tigray diaspora should push for as well. So I think it's interesting in that sense, because, you know, you were repeatedly mentioned that there is no sense of direction, as opposed to what it used to be before, because before, though, it was very clear what the direction was. It was fighting the enemies, right? But we didn't need to wait for direction. But now, because a sense of direction is required, so maybe that is one, you know, a good direction. So maybe we should push for the US government to honor its responsibility as an observer, and the other entities that are sort of, in some sense, party to the agreement. The African Union, I mean, it's a dead body. You know, any self-respecting person shouldn't, you know, mention the African Union, but I'm just saying, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but in terms of Getachew, it doesn't surprise me. He's you know, he's very personable. He's very affable. He's someone that you want to have a conversation with. And he said that you know, he has nice personality and all that, and that is true. And the worry in terms of Ethiopian politics is actually the one, you know, the one quality that is not really needed in Ethiopia is being nice, because Ethiopian politics is just, you know, filled with you know, with Machiavellian calculations, with being nasty, with being calculating, and all that. And, you know, some people wonder if Getachew has those qualities. So it's very tricky. But Millete, just final question in terms of the community work that you're doing, because I think, as I mentioned to you before we started recording, that the most important thing actually in terms of long-term Tigray, the you know, teaching of children to create some sort of connection with their identity. What are your sort of dreams? What are you trying to achieve with children?
You know, I think that the reason we stumbled early on when this war began is that we didn't even realize that history was repeating itself in terms of what was happening in Tigray. And so for a lot of us, it was like a crash course in what does it mean to be a Tigrayan. I actually remember in the protests early on, there's a young woman, her name is Susie Mahmoud here in Denver, and she's like our chanter. I call her the voice of the revolution. Like, you know her voice. You don't know what she looks like, but you know her voice. Very deep, like very, and she would ask, who are we? You know, and of course the response is Tagaru. And early on it was like Tagaru, like kind of like with a question mark, you know, you're kind of looking around like Tagaru. and for sure by, you know, as time went on, that got stronger and stronger. And the response was like, who are we? Tagaru. There was no doubt. It was very firm. And that I'm saying that because that is sort of like what happened with us and our young people. There was a confusion and almost feeling like by being told you're not an Ethiopian, you were something less than that. And so that was hard. That was hard for, I think, for our young people. And so we had to, you know, like shed that layer, shed that skin to really figure out who we are. And so that is a failure on the part of our parents, grandparents, history, storytellers, all of that. So my promise was to myself, at least, and to anyone that I would know or any young people I would be involved with, because I would go to lunch or be in environments with these young people and you could see the confusion, like, what does this mean? Like, there was a young person who at school, one of their friends said, oh, you're Tigrayan, you're from the killer tribe. Somebody, like, literally, this was a conversation with little kids, these are elementary aged young people. And so this kid goes home and is like, what does this mean? And I made a promise that any young person that I'm around will know who they are, know what it means to be a Tigrayan, know your history, understand where you come from. So that way, if you're ever confronted in these kind of situations, you can at least answer back. You don't have to walk away like, is that true? Like, is that who I am? You can firmly, give a response, an appropriate response. And it's not the same as teaching hate. Like, there's a lot of, I feel like, people who have taught their children to hate Tigrayans and demonize Tigrayans, some wittingly, some unwittingly, in terms of how they teach their kids. But to me, I want us to be strong enough to be able to answer back. The Jews do something really powerful. They have what they call a birthright trip, and it's paid by the government. Anyone of Jewish descent in the diaspora is given the right to return home, and their expenses are paid, and they learn about who they are and their history. And like, to me, that is something that we absolutely should do as Tegaru. And so that informs a lot of my work with the community center. And so we, for instance, in 2 weeks, actually, we're going on a trip. We call it Camp Tigray. And it's 3 days, 2 nights. We take our young people out into the mountains of Colorado. And so, which feels really good because we're mountain people too in many parts of Tigray. And so we take them out into the mountains and we talk identity. We have like really honest conversations about, whatever the young people want to talk about. We teach them even just a little bit of history too. We kind of intertwine it in the things that we do. We talk about health and wellness and mental health, and we hike, we have a good time. We relate. So this year actually is going to be great. We have a young woman, Hannah, who lived back home actually and is now in Denver. And she was part of a Tigrayan hikers group back home. And so she's going to be joining us on this trip so she can talk about, like the landscapes of Tigray and just her experiences and where she's hiked and, different mountains and that kind of thing. So we just try and relate it so that there's a connection that's made for our young people as much as we can until we can begin taking them back home and make sure that they get a firsthand experience. That's one thing my mom did for me right when I graduated high school. That summer, we went back home for 3 months. And it was an intense 3 months. And, it was full of joy and full of like, I miss hamburgers, right? I was a teenager. So, but it was so powerful. And after that, I went home pretty much every summer, and maybe a few gaps in between with school and stuff. But, and I would go alone, with my half Tigrinya, broken Tigrinya, whatever you want to call it. And I would just, be with my grandmother or my aunts and family. And, I didn't go for 3 months again, but I would go for 3 weeks, and that every time I grew stronger and closer and understood more. And, we owe that to the young people here, especially because we depend so much on their work and their connections. And, I keep saying we're de facto ambassadors for Tigray. That's not just me. That's all of these young people in the different circles they're in their business circles, at school, at work, and the political work that they're doing. We have a lot of Tigrayans actually who have run and won office, so we need to make sure that they're grounded in who they are. And obviously they're in America, they work for the system here, but there's always going to be some type of connection or political advocacy work that will need to be done. So in a way, by investing in these young people, we're directly investing in the future of Tigray, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's simply brilliant, Millete. Well, so say that you're trying to make sure that children know their history, their identity, and the thought that just occurred to me, and also you mentioned that you're trying to make sure that you're not teaching children to hate anybody, and I think that's very, very important. But in the process of teaching history to Tigrayan children, you will have to teach, for instance, what Ethiopia has done and what Eritrea has done, and all the, you know, biblical cruelty that was inflicted on Tigray. And if you are to teach that to children, how do you make sure that the teaching doesn't trespass into the territory of hate? How, like, where do you draw the boundary? And I say that because, you know, a couple of days ago, I was actually reading an article about how Germany taught its children about you know, what the Nazi did to the Jews. And apparently the education was so intense that some people argue it sort of bordered on self-hate. And that was it was a very, very tricky balance for the you know, German education sort of authorities to make sure that they maintained the right balance between making sure that everybody knew what Germany did, but also making sure that it wasn't, people were not taught to self-hate, because it's a very tricky balance. So it's not the exact problem that we're facing now. It's a opposite actually problem in some sense. How do you teach children to know their history and to make sure that they know what people, because at the end of the day, it was people who did what they, you know, what was done to Tigray. But to make sure that it wasn't hate that they are being taught. So it's a very tricky balance on the face of it, at least to me.
Well, and we have that conversation here in America too, because there's an attempt to sort of whitewash the history of this country in terms of slavery and what happened here and how that's taught in schools. And so I get it. Like, there's a lot of this conversation is happening in a lot of different places. Two things come to mind. One is the work that we do, we never tell this story from the vantage point of a victim. So what we're talking about is, you know, resiliency. We're talking about, well, even just before you even get there, just basically like, what is a Tigrayan? What is Tigray? Like, why should you be proud of where you come from? Because we're more than just what's happened to us. You know what I mean? So we start from that perspective. And then because you have to be honest, and because young people know, and they can look this information up the snap of a finger, and they're hearing about it, whether they look it up or not anyways. So you do have to be honest, but you don't tell that story. It's kind of like, even when I talk about in like interviews that I do, I never talk about victims of genocide. I talk about survivors of genocide, you know, and it's very intentional. The language is intentional because the story that you tell becomes the truth, you know, in many ways. So we're careful about how we tell these stories. But the truth is, until there is justice and accountability, there will be a human instinct for revenge. And so you're never going to get away from that with even our young people here who have secondary trauma about everything that's happened, but especially back home. So the conversations around justice, you know, it's more for Ethiopia and more for Eritrea than it is for us, to be honest, because think about these people who lost their parents, for example, these young children, or someone who lost a sibling, or who saw the worst of humanity. You don't think that human instinct doesn't make you want to seek revenge? It may not be today, could be 20 years later. You know what I mean? Like, it's going to happen. We've seen that cycle of violence happen, you know, over and over again in the Horn of Africa, specifically in Ethiopia. So that's why justice is that much more important. And I feel like we have to really stress that, including with all of these international actors who are, you know, who want us to pretend like there's no drone, so you're fine, you know, and I'm just like, no, we're not. And it may be fine and quiet right now, but if you think that we're not human beings, we are, and there will be revenge. And it's because how can you not? The only way to get around that is to have justice. So, you know, it's part of our history. You can't hide what has happened and who the actors are and all of that. You have to be honest about that. But all the more reason that we have to push for justice, including when you have these conversations with young people who are incredibly intelligent, by the way, who are like really free thinkers and who don't have the same sort of like, you know, just go on to get along and don't worry about it, maybe sort of culture that has been, I think, forced on our people for a while. These are people who are very much about justice, like they grow up in that culture. And not to say that, you know, this is like the most fair country and things are all just and dandy or whatever, but there's more conversation around it, you know. And so I agree. It's a slippery slope for sure, but I just believe in honesty. I just think the more honest you are, you know, the better we are.
Well, I think interesting that you mentioned the case of the United States. According to Abiy Ahmed, the United States is actually a less just country than Ethiopia. When Abiy justifies everything that's happening in Ethiopia, he always mentions the United States and to say that even in the United States, of course, he plucks numbers out of thin air and say that, you know, there are homeless people or black people murdered and stuff like that. But yeah,
he also said he loves America and he would come and fight and die for America too. So I'm like, this guy. That's
what he said. Do you remember the article on the New Yorker? He actually, that's what he literally said, that he would die for America.
Yeah. So
yeah, but we don't have time for Abiy Ahmed anyway. Good that you emphasized the need for justice. I can only, you know, wish that the people who are trying to end the mandate of the UN investigative body would listen to what you're saying. I mean, not that they wouldn't know the importance of justice. It's just they're pretending, lying to themselves for political reasons. But maybe, you know, in terms of the diaspora advocacy, because also that was the theme of this conversation, that is something that we should work on now to try to push as much as we can for the mandate of the team to be extended. Because I think, as things stand, if I'm correct, the mandate might end. It's not done deal, but there is a real worry that the mandate might end in September, and there simply is no way that they would have done a proper investigation because they simply haven't had enough time, and they haven't even set foot in Tigray. So that is something to keep in mind for our listeners. But Millete, it's always a joy to have conversation with you. I'm sorry that I have deprived you of your perfect Friday afternoon. I will make up for that when we meet in Tigray.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. I look forward to
all
that
right.
day.
And but thank you for everything you do. We are grateful for all the work you do, Millete. I know that you don't want to take any credit. You just want to get on with stuff, but doesn't mean that we don't appreciate and recognize the work that you're doing. And thank you so much. If you have something to say, please feel free.
I think we've said everything that can be said. I just want to thank you for what you do and for always challenging, challenging your brothers and sisters, all of us, to think harder and think deeper. And it doesn't mean we have to agree, and it's okay if we don't agree. And I just appreciate that, and thank you for what you do. And free Tigray. That's all I can say.
Free Tigray. Yeah, that's the word. So yeah, thank you, and thank you to our listeners. That was Millete. Thank you for staying with us. And if you disagree with things that we said in this conversation, feel free to express them in the comment section or wherever you want to. I think Millete has a thick skin. She's more than happy to take criticism, and I'm more than happy to take criticism. And I actually welcome criticism. I think what is important that we freely exchange ideas in good faith. That's always welcome. But thank you for staying with us. And if you like what we do on this channel, please like and subscribe, and always spread the word around. And until I see you next time, bye-bye.